Welcome to the Inner Work Community Podcast, which aims to provide you with language, tools, and guidance in your journey towards personal and relational wholeness. We'll discuss topics ranging from psychology, spirituality, tantra, leadership, sexuality, polyamory, and more. My name is Michael, and I'll be your host for insightful interviews with thought leaders, practitioners, and experts who have a thing or two to share about living an integrated and meaning-making life. Whether you're looking to deepen your connection with your interior world, overcome challenges in your relationships, or expand your psychosomatic horizons with fresh perspectives and paradigms, the Inner Work Community Podcast offers a safe yet challenging space for dialogue and introspection. This is all a gift, so let's go enjoy it together. Connie, thank you for being here and gifting us with your time and your wisdom. I mean, these are big topics around shadow work and spirituality and relationships, romantic relationships in particular. So thank you for being here. What a gift.
Thank you for all that you're doing, Michael.
So, Connie, will you kind of define shadow and then talk about how it shows up in our spirituality? Why shadow work? Maybe this is the question. Why is shadow work important for our spiritual lives and our romantic or intimate relationships?
Thank you, Michael. I entered the TM movement at a very young age. I was 19 when I learned TM. And for about 10 years, I was inside that community. And then I began to see things that disturbed me: lying, hypocrisy, rumors about the teacher. And I left in, I guess it was 1979, I think. And I started reading Jung, Carl Jung, and I went into a Jungian analysis. And I was introduced to this idea of the shadow in my dreams with this analyst. And I began to recognize, as I began to study and understand, I began to recognize that I had kind of used my spirituality, both the practice and the concepts, to defend against certain emotional issues that I had from my family. Decades later, I learned the term spiritual bypass from John Wellwood and Ken Wilber. And that's kind of well understood now that a lot of people do that. But at the time, it was really a revelation to me. In the 90s, I went to graduate school in-depth psychology to study Jung and become a clinician. And I wrote my dissertation on the holy longing, which is a term from the poet Goethe about our yearning for the transcendent, our yearning for God, for the divine, for spirit, whatever we call it. That there's an innate longing in many people. We could say it's a longing of the soul for the beloved. So in those days, I was trying to bridge psychology and spirituality. I was trying to use each of them to understand the other one. And then when I became a therapist, I was in private practice for about 30 years. I began to hear that yearning in my clients. People who intuited that there was something more than they were seeing or hearing, something more that they could think about, something more than physical, rational reality. And before I was a clinician, I worked in publishing. And I did this anthology called Meeting the Shadow before I had my graduate degree. And Meeting the Shadow kind of collected, I think it's 60 different experts on the topic. And it really struck a chord. And I realized that there just was not sort of popular material out there to help people understand the shadows. The term shadow is Jung's name for the personal unconscious. The part of us that's like a blind spot. You know, we turn to look at it and we can't see it because it's hidden from us. Its nature is to hide. And it holds, we used to think it was like Freud thought it was a little corner in the mind, But actually, since we know that the mind and the body are functionally identical now, we know that the shadow is everywhere. It's in our muscles and nerves as much as it's in our minds and our consciousness. And so I began to realize that I began to understand that the shadow contained our secret desires, not only, quote, negative impulses that we had to bury in childhood, like shame or sexuality or anger or sadness, because we were told that those were bad, right? You're a sissy if you cry, or you don't want to be an angry girl, or you don't want to be stupid in school, or you don't want to touch yourself, right? All these messages that we got from adults as kids form shadow content. But those are only negative in relation to the ego, the conscious personality that develops along with the shadow. So we're getting all these positive messages, right? Good girl, good student, good boy, you're nice, you're generous, right? Good big sister, whatever the message is. And that reinforces the formation of the ego, and whatever does not go there into our conscious personality gets repressed into the shadow. I like to say, what doesn't get expressed gets repressed. So the shadow and the ego are developing hand in hand. And when meeting the shadow kind of struck a chord in the collective, I realized that this was kind of a fertile ground for me to keep exploring. And after I got my doctorate, I wrote Romancing the Shadow with a colleague, in which we developed this practice, this method for uncovering the secret hidden content in the shadow. We called it shadow work. And both of those books, Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, are coming out in new editions in this next year, because now the shadow has kind of risen into popularity thanks to Michael and Kayla Shaheen and other people who are getting a lot of publicity about it. So there's a different way to think about the shadow, which is it's like a dark room in which our dreams and images lie dormant. And shadow work is like the process of development that brings them back to life. And at different stages of our life, when we're exploring spirituality or aging or relationships, different material will erupt from the shadow. So in a relationship, maybe the critic erupts and it creates repetitive fights, right? Or when we're aging, maybe the inner ageist erupts and we're in denial and trying to make ourselves look young and act young, right? Or in spirituality, maybe our need to feel seen and loved and special from childhood erupts, and we find a teacher, and the teacher meets that need. And so we're blind to everything else that's going on, right? Maybe that clergy person is stealing money or being cruel to someone. We don't want to see it because those needs are coming up, those unmet early needs are coming out of the shadow and they're being met. And so they blind us. And so this process happens in different contexts, in different stages of life. And so shadow work is a tool that we can kind of take with us through the lifespan if we're oriented to inner work.
I love it so much. Maybe I want to stick with the spiritual side of things for a moment, because you mentioned spiritual bypassing. For a lot of people, what you might define as spiritual bypassing is actually really promoted in a lot of spiritual communities as spiritual practice, or the thing you're supposed to do to soothe or reconnect with the divine. But when you call it spiritual bypassing, in some ways, from a Jungian perspective, we're actually avoiding the divine within in some ways. So I'm curious, can you unpack the spiritual bypassing? And for those of us who've grown up and been really saturated by this sense that I can't do that because it's morally reprehensible or God does not want it, what is our That's an existential fear that like we're going to transgress some divine being that can really do some damage to us. How do we begin doing shadow work when the stakes are that high?
Well, there are a lot of myths about the shadow. I'm doing a Substack now with Kayla Shaheen, and we were just posting about this. If we use theological language, we get in trouble with the shadow, because then people say it's evil, it's demonic, you're going to go to hell, right? And that either or black and white thinking doesn't allow for psychological exploration and inner work. It just closes the door on it, and I think for some people, there's a need to hold both. Some people aren't ready to give up theological thinking. That's okay, or belief in that belief. And at the same time, recognize, is it stopping you from emotional healing? Is it stopping you from looking at trauma, or dealing with accountability, or dealing with certain communication that needs to happen with someone, or becoming a whistleblower, like I write about in Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path? So if we are threatened with going to hell, or being reborn as a dog, right? Or damnation, or whatever the threat is, that is a form of control from my point of view. That is a form of coercion, because the message is basically saying, don't look, don't see, don't touch, don't do it. And and I'm not saying that everything is okay to do, or everything. I'm not advocating free license here. What I'm advocating is self-reflection, attunement to our inner world, learning how to attune to your own thoughts and feelings and sensations in your body in order to see what's emerging, what's arising. Because without that, you're just dependent on an outer authority telling you how it is. And that's not, from my point of view, that's not spirituality. It may be organized religion. It may be good for people at some stage of life who need that guidance. Okay. A lot of people need that at some stages of life. But when you're ready to kind of explore your own spirituality in a more direct connection to the divine, that doesn't work. So it's a myth that the shadow is all bad. A lot of what we're seeing today in the news with the election coming up is a weaponization of shadow projection. And so when we project what is unconscious or denied in ourselves onto other people, right? They're dirty, they're bad, they're garbage, they're ignorant, they're illegal, whatever it is, anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia. I mean, it's, anti-immigrant, all the stuff that's there now, it's all shadow projection. It's about attribute us and them. It's a way of creating us and them. So I'm going to make an analogy I've never said this before, but it's occurring to me because of your question. In some religious communities and spiritual communities, there's an us and them between the clergy and the practitioner and the disciple, the acolyte, whatever we call the parishioner. There's an us and them, which is that we are unenlightened, unsophisticated, unbelievers, and they have it, whatever the it is, the direct connection to the divine, right? And so what that is that's a shadow projection of the light. Instead of projecting the dark, which we're seeing every day now, we're projecting the light. But it's still from our own unconscious, that which we don't own in ourselves, our own divinity, our own connection to the divine. We're giving it away. But psychologically, if we look at the dynamics of what's happening and find a way to be in a church community or a synagogue or a Hindu community or a Buddhist community or a Sufi community. Try to find a way to be in a spiritual community that's conscious, that you're doing with awareness, not with spiritual bypass, meaning you're bypassing the shadow issues in order to transcend and get high and evolve. This happens a lot in the yoga world. There have been a lot of that. The book that I wrote about this has a huge chapter on all the scandals that have happened with all the different teachers. And there's been a lot in the yoga world. And I think part of it is because of spiritual bypass. You do your yoga, you sit in your meditation, and you don't have to do anything else. You don't have to do other self-improvement because that'll solve everything. And as I told you about my own early life, it's not true. Spiritual practice doesn't resolve psychological issues. It can teach you how to calm yourself. It can reduce anxiety. It doesn't change your complexes, your neuroses, your deeply rooted emotional trauma. So for me, psychology and spirituality need each other. And we don't want to use one to bypass the other one. They really need each other. For that, when I was a clinician, I would teach shadow work, but I would always teach meditation to go with it so that people could learn how to center themselves and calm themselves in order to meet the shadow, right? If they're looking at some really difficult aspect of themselves, their addiction, right? Or their rage, or their victim, their inner victim, or whatever it is, you need a way to center, to prepare for that. So for me, these go together. And I know that's not discussed a lot because our sort of academic silos are so separated. People who specialize in psychology poo-poo spirituality and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, this is that split. I would say, I could probably paint with a broad stroke. Anyone listening to this is likely coming to it with a sense of that's not a complete paradigm. I can't continue to do the work I know I need to do to heal, to move towards wholeness in a spiritual community that doesn't value the body, that doesn't value women, that doesn't value the darkness, the hidden, what is behind me, what might be motivating me. And so I would say anyone listening is likely coming to this with like, okay, there's got to be more. I know there's more. How do I get to it? And you talked about projection. And I think that when it comes to the trailheads into the dense, dark forest of our personal unconscious, projections are huge. Can you talk a little bit about how projections play out in romantic relationships? I want to use those broadly because we have people on the call who are newly married, been married for a long time, been divorced. A broad sweep here. But when it comes to intimate relationships, how do projections tend to function in those spaces?
So again, people think projection is bad, right? But we're actually built that way. It's inevitable. We can't not project. And here's the reason why. We're single, we're dating, we meet a woman or a man, and what happens? We feel an attraction. We start talking to ourselves about who this person is. We have feelings about him or her, even before we know the person, right? And part of what's happening is that the shadow is leading us to find someone for a particular reason, to meet certain needs, to heal certain issues, to become conscious in certain ways. And so when both people have that experience, then it feels like there's a fit. It feels like they're a match. It's the one, right? They both say to themselves. And what does that really mean? Because I've had clients feel that after a date or a month or 2 months, right? And I'll say, You don't know who the person is for a year until you've had some really big fights. No, 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 I know this is the person, right? So what is that? Part of what's happening is we're projecting or unconsciously attributing to that person certain things that we don't see in ourselves. Oh, he's really independent. I love it. And he's earning a lot of money and he's athletic. And I'm none of those things, right? Or we project a parent. And this is really common. I don't know if there's any psychologists on the call, but this is kind of cliched. She seems really nurturing. And my mother wasn't nurturing. Oh, maybe I can get from her what I didn't get from my mother. And so he projects the good mother onto the woman unconsciously. He doesn't know he's doing that. She doesn't know she's doing that. But what happens then? These expectations get set up. People fall into these roles really quickly. And they start meeting these needs because they want it to work out, right? They want to feel that love. They want the endorphin rush. And so they fall into these roles and then they don't show these parts of themselves that don't fit. So she may have some behavior that's mothering. She also may be a bitch. When she gets angry, she's nasty, right? Or when she gets hurt, she's punitive or withdrawn, right? She's not mothering or maternal or comforting. Because we all have all of these parts. But when we start hiding them, then, what happens is people get married during the romantic cycle in the relationship. You can walk into a dinner party and see someone you've never seen before and have a really exaggerated emotional reaction, right? Ooh, I don't like that person. He's aggressive or he's seductive or she's whatever it is. That's a projection and you know nothing about that person, right? It's a judgment, it's a fear, it's an attraction. It could be a positive projection or a negative projection. What's been really interesting for me is to teach people how to attune to themselves, how to watch those thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations, because there are 3 cues that a shadow character is erupting. And the same shadow character, let's say the critic, always has the same thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations, always the same. Or the foodie, or the tyrant, or the needy child, always has the same 3 cues. And once you can identify them, you know who's showing up from your unconscious. I call that a shadow character. And then you can learn how to create a more conscious relationship with it.
I'm thinking about Robert Johnson's work, Inner Gold, and the understanding psychological projection, and how he talks about in his time in India, people, the practice of asking someone to carry the image of God for you. And what I love about that is it's a conscious way of engaging this function of projection that, like you said, isn't good or bad. We just do it. And when it comes to the religious space, the romantic space, my sense is, okay, yes, you're going to project, that is going to happen, and that's not bad, but be conscious about it. When I look at them, what am I seeing? Am I seeing something that is not in me that I can't even own, whether that I judge that as good or I judge that as bad? Or can I approach this relationship with a conscious sense that, yeah, what I'm drawn to in them may very well be something that I haven't yet fully owned in myself. And how, I don't know if this is like, do you have, Connie, a sense of how can we do this consciously? How can we approach relationships, whether in the religious, spiritual realm or relational realm? How can we approach them consciously with our projections rather than trying to be like, oh, I'm projecting again? Because that's usually the thing, is like, oh, I'm projecting, I shouldn't project. No, like, you can use your projection to help you, actually.
So, what these 2 arenas of love and spirituality have in common around projection is they're both projecting the ideal. right? These are not negative projections onto the divine or the lover. They're both projecting the ideal. So one thing we can remember in each context is that these are human beings. They're not gods, and they're not ideals. And even human beings who claim to be awake or enlightened are not perfect. They still have shadows. They still have unconscious material, and they still risk acting it out, just like your spouse does. So part of it is setting up that understanding, I think, and then being able to catch it in the moment. So I've learned so much being married to my husband for almost 30 years now about this process. And I wrote about our early years in Romancing the Shadow. But he has evolved so much spiritually. He's in a very high level of consciousness now, full time. And he still has his neuroses. He still has his blind spots. He doesn't really get triggered anymore. He doesn't have a lot of the stuff that used to cause conflict between us anymore. But he's not perfect. He makes mistakes. He's human. And when we can remember that, no matter who the teacher is, even if it's a teacher who consciously says, you can project the divine onto me, I will carry that for you, right? Whether that is a priest or a guru, a roshi or a rabbi, you make that conscious choice in a relationship, still, that person can still act out the shadow. And just knowing that is really important because it keeps you eyes wide open. You know, you can't go to sleep in that relationship when you know that. So I think it's not, as you said, it's not about avoiding or preventing projection. I don't really think that's possible. People project onto their kids. I mean, I can see my stepkids and their friends projecting all over their little kids, my grandkids now. The dreams they have for them, the pressure they put on them, the way they're shaping them and wanting them to be, you know, this is happening. It's everywhere. And it's certainly in our body politic, as I was saying.
When it comes to maybe spiritual abuse, religious trauma, you bring forward Marlene Winnell's work around the religious trauma syndrome. Can you kind of unpack that a bit? Because like I mentioned early on, spiritual bypass, what you call spiritual bypass, a lot of particularly Christians or evangelicals would call spiritual practice. So when it comes to religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and you make parallels between like alcoholic homes and abusive spiritual communities, right? And some of the similarities there. What are some of the key signs, symptoms, observable things that that you've noticed that are common among people in religious communities that kind of point towards some spiritual abuse, or at least the potential for an atmosphere that is setting up for that kind of abuse?
So, you know, there are various layers of the shadow because we're focusing on the personal shadow in the individual. But that shadow is nested in a family shadow. And the whole family system, it has secrets, it has rules, right? And that's kind of nested in a community. So maybe in a religious community. And that group has shadow issues. What you can do, what you can't do, what's taboo, right? What are the secrets? What are the punishments? Shaming, excommunication, right? There's group shadow. There's a national shadow, right? There's a global shadow. We could say, you know, denial of the climate crisis is part of the global shadow. So if you're looking at one particular religious community as an example, there's all these individuals who have their personal shadow issues that they bring to the community, which forms a group shadow or a collective shadow. So, for example, and if that community has very long-term institutional morals, mores, norms, taboos, and so on. Those have been there for a long time, and everybody kind of takes them for granted, right? And they're transmitted through the generations, just like the family shadow is transmitted, like child abuse is transmitted through generations. Same thing in a church community, right? So I would say the things to watch for are secrets, control, coercion. Check in with yourself. Are you feeling more freedom or more controlled? Are you able to speak your truth in this community, or do you fear XYZ if you do that? What is your projection onto the pastor or minister or priest or rabbi? How are you holding that person, he or she? What are you saying to yourself about the leader? What happens if there's a breakdown or a scandal? Is there denial and everything is stuffed away? That's really a big red flag. Let's say there's a rumor that he has sex with a parishioner. What happens? What are the consequences? Does anything change from that? Or let's say there's financial shadow. They start out, asking you to tithe, and then they ask you for more money. And then somebody says, well, put us in your will. And then, and it keeps kind of growing. The demand for money keeps growing. We want your family money. Big red flag. So power, sex, and money are the three big ways that the shadow shows up, whether it's in couples, friendships, workplace, religious community. Power, sex, and money are really the arenas to watch for. And lies. So I have a few examples in Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path I have a lot of examples of scandals, but I have a few of communities that actually were able to take the scandal and reimagine and reorganize the community in beautiful ways. Sort of changing the patriarchal issues, changing the roles of women, changing the agreements around money, all kinds of things that they were actually able to reorganize. And so the breakdown led to a breakthrough. In most places, that doesn't happen. I mean, we haven't seen that with the Catholic Church as an example, right? Last week, the new report just came out. There's not going to be any big change there. I highly recommend the film Conclave, by the way. It's fascinating. So those are the things to watch for. And some of you will be more body-centered, and your body will speak to you if you're in danger, or if there is a lie or hypocrisy going on, your body will tell you. And some of you will be more like me. I'm more auditory. My thoughts tell me, but I have to tune in because it can be very subtle. That's a lie. There's a risk. I'm feeling doubt. Okay, what is this really? Do I want to look at this, right? Some of you will catch it through a feeling, an emotion. But as you learn to tune in, those are the ways that you can kind of detect your own internal shadow issues and also the interpersonal and group shadow issues that emerge.
Thank you so much, Connie. The words that you're speaking out likely will find their way into the nooks and crannies that we're all kind of carrying, right? These little dimly lit areas of our own personal unconscious and personal experience. Hi, Michael here. Hey, seriously, thank you for listening and engaging the Inner Work Community podcast. I trust today's episode gave you something to reflect on or illuminated a new trailhead to your hidden life. If this episode resonated with you, you can subscribe, share it with your people, and leave a review. That really helps spread the word and boost our online presence in this digital world. Remember, growth is not a straight line, and we're all figuring it out as we go. I'm grateful to be in this unfolding and excavating work with you. So, until next time, be yourself. you've got a good self. And remember, it's all a gift.